stay, please click the got it. Do not leave the meeting. And we promise not to, publish this on the internet or anything like that. We're just going to give it to people who wanted to see this, wanted to be here and couldn't. So, my friends, I'd love for you to meet the Reverend Stephanie Anthony, who is longstanding of mine for lots of reasons. And she's the pastor of Fox Valley Presbyterian Church in Geneva, Illinois, and is the moderator of the Committee on the General Assembly. Her group is doing some interesting and innovative things as preparations are happening for the 225th, fifth meeting of the General Assembly, which will be next summer. And it made a lot of sense to a lot of people to ask if someone would come from COGA. So we started at the top and asked the moderator to come and join us to talk about those innovations and changes and how things are going to be different and how we are approaching this as a presbytery. Having about the differences in General Assembly, I hope will start to be a part of your discernment and that of others. I hope you will carry this message, friends who are with us today, to your congregations, as well as to ponder them in your own hearts to see if you would be interested in applying to be a commissioner, either a teaching elder, a ruling elder, or a young adult advisory delegate. So Stephanie, welcome. Usually what we do is we begin with a word of prayer. We turn it over to our special guest star. You get to shape this time however you'd like. If you'd like it to be a conversation, if you want to use the chat, if you want people to hold their questions till the very end. We typically have about 45 minutes of presentation, conversation, however you want to shape that. And then we hit the pause button and talk about what's happening next week, and we close with prayer. And then when we've had larger gatherings of folks for these, we've invited folks to linger afterwards in case they wanted to ask something privately, about Fox Valley Presbyterian Church, or just want to ask their questions in a bigger group. I don't think we're going to need to do that with such a small group today. So we will conclude promptly at the top of the hour. So let's begin with a word of prayer, and then Stephanie, it's all yours. Let's pray. God, we thank you for the beauty of this day. We thank you for technology that connects us across the miles and across a couple of time zones and allows us to meet and reflect and learn and grow in our understanding of our church, your church, and ourselves. We're grateful for this time together. We're grateful for the denomination of which we are a part, and we're grateful for the ways in which you are at work in our lives, in our congregations, and in the wider church. Be with us today as we seek to greater understanding and greater discernment. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. Great. Stephanie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be here with y'all. And so, yeah, when we're thinking about format and how we're laid out, please ask questions as they come up. That's way easier for me to remember them while we're in the same topic. So that's great. And I get really sick of hearing my voice. So that would be awesome. That would be wonderful. My name, as you've heard, is Stephanie Anthony. When my pronouns use she and her. I am the pastor of Fox Valley Presbyterian Church, as Jennifer said, in Geneva, which is a far western suburb of Chicago. I've been here about 4.5. We're coming up on 5 years this coming fall. A little bit of background to how I got into some of this work that I do. I've been in ordained ministry for 19 years. I've served as a head of staff, as an associate pastor, as a solo pastor in small cities, small towns, and suburban contexts. So a few different experiences and contexts. The church beyond the congregational experience, the presbytery, the synod, the General Assembly has for a lot of my life, and sometimes really even most of my life, depending on the period, has been as much of a home as a local congregation has. Some of that's a story for another day, but I have been engaged in presbytery things since I was about 14, synod stuff when I was about 15, General Assemblies started at 19. And so moving outside of congregational circles into the wider church has been a huge part of my experience. And in all of that, General Assemblies in particular have been a place of great joy for me, sometimes some frustration and sorrow. But most of all, I love how we as a church have discerned the way to listen to, or a way to listen to God's voice and God's leading in the church. And so being involved in assemblies and the work of the larger churches is really, really important to me. To that end, my experience with assemblies has been a little observer when I was in high school at one point. A youth advisory delegate, as we called them then, instead of young adult advisory delegates. We used to have seminary student, two T's. Seminary student assistants was a job that used to exist. It doesn't so much anymore. I was a commissioner, committee leadership, and then now on the committee of the Office of the General Assembly. So it's embedded in a large part of my call and how I live out my call in the Presbyterian Church. And so I'm excited by the way that the Spirit works. Sometimes I'm baffled by the way that the Spirit works, but I pretty much always can find a way that the Spirit is working through the assemblies in one way or another. There are, as I imagine most of you know, some big changes coming to this next assembly, the 225th. They are exciting to me in many ways, and they're, in all honesty, sort of scary to me as well. It is a new way of doing things that's very different from what many of us fell in love with when we fell in love with assemblies. And so getting used to that and figuring out our places in it is difficult. For those of you who are newer to assemblies in general, the traditional, the way we've always done it, at least in anybody's recent memory, has been really about an 8-day conference style business meeting. Typically folks are there Saturday to Saturday. Many really come in on a Friday and leave the next Saturday. So 8 or 9 days on the ground. Big, huge convention center halls with several hundred people sitting in voting desks and several hundred to several thousand people watching in an observer area. It's a big, massive experience. 15-ish committees of 60 to 80 sometimes members of those committees. Those numbers have varied a little bit over the years as the church has been different sizes, and we've redone some ratios, but that's a decent average. You spend a couple of days in the big, huge convention center doing some important votes, just getting everything settled, and then electing the moderators of the assembly is a huge highlight in that first couple of days. And then you meet in your committees for about 3 or 4 days, 3.5 days, Sunday night through Wednesday-ish, Tuesday or Wednesday. Sort of depends on the year a little bit. But you meet in your committees and work on just a small subset of the 100 to 150 items of business that come before the entire assembly. And after your committee has sort of perfected those and made some recommendations, then we meet back in the big plenary hall again with, again, the 400-ish, 500-ish people voting and everybody else watching behind. The audience that watches sort of waxes and wanes depending on how interested they are in the topic that's being discussed at any given moment. On our big high profile topics, that room can fill up. Other times it can be a lot emptier. And then we vote on all those committee recommendations, vote them up, down, different, refer, change them, move them along one way or another. That's sort of the general flow of what we call the normal assembly, right? Around the assembly is a huge exhibit hall, in another space, but happening at the same time with the different agencies of the church, bookstore, different vendors sort of selling their church-related activities and products are going on. The local hosting presbytery hosts mission field trips, basically. They go out and show you what's going on in their presbytery and what's going on in the presbyteries nearby and how the church is at work in the world. So there's lots of things to do for people who are visiting, as well as those who are there for the business of the meeting. I lay that land a little so that when I talk about the changes, for those for whom that is new, you can see how dramatically different some of what we're talking about this next year are going to be. Before I jump to next year, 2022, which is the 225th General Assembly, last year was an assembly year, and it was scheduled for June, so month 3 of a global pandemic, or maybe month 6, I guess, month 3 from when many of us shut down in this country anyway. And things changed on a dime. I can remember being at our COGA meeting in February and one of our members comes from Seattle going, "You guys, this is really much bigger than you seem to understand here." The rest of you from around the country, we had a very, very brief, in fact, I'd even forgotten about it by the time I got home, a very brief discussion about what to do if this pandemic thing happens. What's this going to be like? And there was a little report that said staff is working on something, and that was about it. And within a month, everything, as it did everywhere else, changed dramatically. And we were suddenly meeting 2 and 3 and 4 times a week, trying to figure out what were we going to do about this assembly. That by our bylaws and by the rules of the church had to take place in some way, shape, or form, but that we didn't have protocols for doing online. Actually, a lot of folks didn't. That wasn't a thing many organizations had yet turned into normal protocols. So we had all sorts of things up in the air about how to do this and how, when, and in what shape. And so it ended up, as I imagine, taking place all online. The moderators and some staff were in the office, and that was about it, and everything else. The Zoom to end all Zooms with several hundred people took place. It was a very reduced assembly, of course. On recommendation from the committee that I serve, we suggested that the commissioners deal with just very limited business because we just didn't have the infrastructure to figure out how to do everything else on such short notice. We essentially went from an old style assembly to a whole new thing in about 8 weeks, with our technology folks working their tails off to create new systems. How do you do Robert's Rules online? We now have a whole computer program that didn't exist. How to make a motion, how to second the motion, how to say you want to speak, and we've actually partnered with some other denominations, and the Church of Canada has used that now. The UCC's used it last week. Church of Scotland is using it or already has used it. So we've sort of packaged this thing we made up and are offering it to our friends and colleagues around the world and around the country. So then, as soon as that planning of that assembly ended, I think the next day, I called in from vacation so we could figure out, oh no, what are we going to do next time? Because we're going to do this in 2 years, and we don't know how long this pandemic is lasting. And even today, I was thinking about it. I said, we're partway through the pandemic, but I don't know what part. I don't know if we're halfway through. I don't know if we're a quarter through. I hope we're more than a quarter through. Maybe we're 3/4 through. But we don't know how far along we are. And that sort of changes on a almost daily basis, it feels. So we knew we were going to be doing something different again. And then, like many churches and many presbyteries, we started to think about, well, what opportunities does this change allow? If we have to change, what opportunity do we have to examine what's working, what's not working? What opportunities do we have to see how our technology can serve us, and how we can be and do be the assembly and do the work in some different ways? And so we have taken on some experiments, and I've been saying, and I know others have been who've been doing some talking around the church, that I don't have any feeling that what we have landed on is the way it's going to be forever. This is not the way we've always done it. It's the way we're doing it this time. And I have full expectation that it will continue to evolve into 226 and 227 and beyond, as we sort of find a new new equilibrium and a new place that'll serve the church, and more importantly, serve God's purposes for the church. So that quick, not so quick intro to how we got here leads us to sort of the function and the structure of what 225 is shaping up to be. It was supposed to have been held in Columbus, Ohio, and with their partnership and their agreement, we have decided to pull it back to Louisville. That gives us a home base for doing new things, where we have our staff all in one place, where we have some familiar structures and aren't working with hotel Wi-Fi or conference center issues, but we can work in our own space to try out some new things. We have decided to hold the assembly partially in person and partially online. And so trying to make sure that we are able to nurture the relationships that grow up during an assembly and that allow folks to work and to trust each other. We're going to bring commissioners in for the committee meetings and then send everybody home for online plenary, having in hopes, having built those relationships around those committee room tables and getting that experience of being together first, and then work online together after they know each other, or at least they know small groups of each other. So instead of the 8 to 9 day, all week, 14 hours a day experience, it's going to be 2 weeks of committee meetings where each group of committees is only in town for 3 to 4 days. The first group that comes in stays a little bit longer because they have to do a plenary in person to allow us to have a meeting. So they'll be on hand in town in Louisville a little longer than the others. But the other committees will either fly in on I'm gonna have to get my schedule right in my head. Fly in on, say, a Wednesday and meet Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, flying home Saturday night or Sunday morning. Then the next group flies in Sunday, works Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, fly home Wednesday night or Thursday morning. So they'll be staggered. 4 committees coming in in 4 different batches over the course of 2 weeks, 16 committees total, if that makes sense. And then while they're in person, they'll be able to meet at the center, at the Presbyterian Center, instead of in sort of hotel ballrooms or convention center ballrooms. We'll have the space on site to do that. Some renovations are taking place in the building, both for the assembly, but also for longer term, for the meetings that happen of the church that we usually have to take to conference centers or hotels and rent space around the country for special committee meetings. We're going to make our space useful to the whole church in that way. So those committees will happen over a course of 2 weeks, but nobody is in town for 2 weeks. Everybody's in town for their own chunk of it at 3 to 5 days at the most during the 2 week period. And then I think we hit 4th of July. Everybody gets home and gets settled for a couple of days. And then we have the plenary online. So a commissioner or an advisory delegate might work, I'm trying to pull up the dates in my head, might be on site in Louisville. If you're in the first committee group, you're on site from like June 18 to the 21st, 22nd. And then you go home. And then you sign back on again July, I believe 5th is I think we start right away. I'm pulling up my calendar because I should have had it in front of me. Start up again on July 5th or 6th. So you've had a couple of weeks of not being engaged and involved in the same way. Others might come at the, if you're in the last chunk, then you'll have the last few days of June, get home, have and even maybe the first day of July or so, get home, have your 4th of July holiday, and then start back in on the committee work. So it's different for sure in that way. And it's really helpful for folks to have a sense that that's going to be the case. It's usually when you're elected as a commissioner and advisory delegate, you know exactly which 8 or 9 days you're going to be traveling and can plan around. And so we recognize that that's a challenge, and it's a different challenge than we've had in the past. But hoping for some grace and some flexibility around that. What else is most helpful right at here? Maybe I pause a little bit. I've been talking a whole lot. And see if there's some questions that have popped up.
Stephanie, I'll start because we're just talking about the staggered schedule, but the fact that people have to kind of reserve the bigger chunk of time until they learn when their committee assignment is. Right. So the question is, by when will people know their committee assignment so they know what their exact time commitment?
Right. On a traditional schedule, you tend not to know that assignment until March or April, I think is when or April is probably safer to say than March. Committee leaders are typically identified by March. What we're hoping and asking folks to really be partners with us in this is the sooner, so presbyteries don't have to elect their commissioners until either December or January, depending on how the calendar falls in a given year. That's the required deadline. We're asking folks to do that as soon as possible instead of as late as possible, because if we get all our commissioner names in early, then we can make those assignments earlier. So if we work to the deadline, then it could be April before folks know what committee they're on, and we really those are the deadlines that were assigned pre this kind of assembly. So the sooner presbyteries can get folks elected, the better we can get. We would love to have committee assignments out by February, but that'll just require everybody doing the presbyteries doing their legwork a little bit ahead of time. So that's our big hope. So it could be as late as March before we know the exact dates that folks have to be available. We hope that it's much earlier than that, or at least February-ish earlier than that. That's the biggest cringy face I make about this assembly. That's the part that's the hardest, because I've had to reserve time too. This is something we're all at this point. I think I'm going to be in Louisville for 3 weeks, and I'm trying to explain around that.
Sure. Well, thank you for that answer. It's candid and it's helpful to know that the Office of the General Assembly will let people know as quickly as possible, but it depends upon how quickly people will respond.
And we know we're asking folks to do, presbytery. If they're presbytery I've been, I won't blame all of them. Have a pattern. This is what we do in November. This is what we do in August. And if we only meet 2 or 3 times a year, which many do, then we have to change our schedules a little bit. So I know that's a big change for everybody. But if we can all do our best to get those in sooner, then we'll be able to act on it sooner. That's
great. See if there are other questions at this point. All you have to do is unmute your mic if you've got a question, and we'll magically know that's why you've unmuted, because you have a question. So far, so good, Stephanie. It must be that you're abundantly clear. Find their unmute buttons.
Or so confusing, nobody can figure out how to ask a question. That's always a possibility.
I doubt that. So carry on.
Carry on. let's see, some of the other things that will feel different this time around, but that we're working on some adjustments for, and when the whole assembly happens at once, all in one space and in one contiguous time period, consecutive, that's the word I was looking for. Things have grown up around the assembly. And so traditions that, Tuesday night is Presbytery dinner night. And a lot of presbyteries take their commissioners and advisory delegates out to dinner on Tuesday night. And Wednesday are seminary lunch days. And so there are some of those things that are traditions, and there are some affiliated groups to the denomination that have a breakfast that brings in a speaker, or an awards ceremony over lunch. And there's a lot of these relationship building pieces that are important to a lot of people, and folks have gotten used to and are sort of in love with, and mean a lot to them in their faith and in their relationships, that don't really fit when everybody's not in the same place at the same time. And so that's a big difference. And I think that's one of the reasons. We're recording, aren't we? Okay, so I think that's one of the reasons that this experiment is an experiment and not the way we're going to do it forever. Because it's because those things are important to the church, and they are important to people who are around the assembly and come to the assembly. And there may be other ways that in other places we can try to put some of those things, the big tent event or otherwise, but the assembly might just be where they have grown and are hard to do in a different place. And so we are trying to, and working with some of these affiliated organizations and the seminaries and some of the other groups that do these lunches and breakfasts and parties and dances and things like that, to see if there are ways that we can support what they try to do through this format of the assembly, whether that is other online meetings that happen around. And in the same way, somebody might get there. I guess we haven't done a paper brochure in probably a decade, but the way you get your schedule of events and know I want to sign up for that activity, well, we can do that with online type activities as well. And so there'll be some gatherings. And I saw some fantastic success with those with the UCC General Synod that took place just last week. That were, I saw a colleague who works in the national church at the UCC offices who said, we had more people involved in our lunch on, whatever the topic was, because people who didn't come physically to the assembly actually took place in the speaker event in ways that haven't happened in the past. We often have folks following along on social media who seem to be as informed as people in the room, paying attention to what's going on in the assembly, watching the live stream, but aren't engaging with the speakers or the seminary lunches or the reunions and things like that. So moving some of those into online spaces, while again, not the way we're used to, might have some benefits as well that we can capitalize on for this time. A year ago, I thought for sure we'd all be moving around the country really comfortably last summer. 2 months ago, I thought we would all be really moving around the country comfortably next summer. Today, I'm not nearly as confident about that as I was last week. I'm growing more and more concerned about big group gatherings next year as the Delta variant pieces take place and as vaccine hesitancy continues. So the things that I thought we wouldn't really need to be solving for pandemic wise, I think really are going to be at play in next year's assembly more than I thought so originally. So those are a few more of the ways that we're trying to keep that spirit of the family reunion alive as best we can with the without bringing big groups together unsafely, which is a concern.
I have a question. So Lucia, in the middle of Indiana somewhere. So the question I have is, if you would unpack just a little more of how the actual, so after you have all those committees and everything, so most of it after that is online, most of the business that would be happening is online. Is that correct?
Correct.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah, after the committees do their work in person, very similar to what we're used to, in terms of they deal with only topics that are sent to their committee. Then when we'll do the reports, folks will just do it via Zoom, which I imagine is similar to what you're doing at the Presbytery, where one person sort of presents the report and then we work through Robert's rules and changes. We hope that, well, we hope this every assembly. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. But we hope that the impulse to want to wordsmith via Zoom will be decreased, and that we can trust the work of committees and do a lot of that work on the ground when people are in person. But that works in person sometimes, and it works in person, doesn't work other times. It maybe have the same on Zoom, but we know that that's hard on Zoom, doing some of that wordsmithing and keeping the substantive conversation is fantastic on Zoom. Wordsmithing makes me want to hit my eyeballs.
And you have the power of mute.
Right.
Mute.
Right. There is a mute button a little bit differently, isn't there? Thanks.
Other questions at this point? I'm going to put up in the chat the link to our Presbytery's website and how you can get right to the information about our Presbytery's process and deadlines for making applications. Please feel free to look at it with your own nomination in mind, perhaps, or perhaps you know somebody who would be a great nominee as well. Send them the link to this website so that they can learn more about what the Presbytery of Wabash Valley is asking of them in terms of making an application to serve. I also want to put Vicki on the spot here and say if folks here today would like access to the recording in order to pass it on to people who might want to learn more about the process and what's going to be new and at GA, how should they contact you directly, or will we put the link in God Calls? Yes, and both.
I can do that. I've already had a request. And so what I've done is put together a shared folder that I will drop that recording in through Dropbox, and then I can share it with anybody, because it's hard to, they're sizable documents, so it's hard to share them via email. So
Right.
Dropbox is such a good way, or I can convert it into a YouTube and post it on the website. Yep.
Your choice. You should. It's your call. What's easiest and most useful.
Okay.
So, if folks would like it, should they simply contact you and you can
Direct them.
Either it's on YouTube or in Dropbox?
I'll do it both ways.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Easy enough.
Stephanie's also put the link to GA's page on the USA.org website.
Yeah, this is the page that is specifically about the assembly, and there's a couple things that I wanted to make sure that you saw. If you go to that website, for when you first get there, there should be a pop-up that comes up on your screen, an opportunity to sign up for a newsletter. We've got a newsletter going on the road to GA that comes out, a couple times a month. It's certainly not spamming my inbox by any means. I don't think we're doing it necessarily weekly at this point. So a couple times a month, there'll be some sort of behind the scenes, what's going on planning wise, what to expect, what we need from supporters, commissioners, presbytery leaders, a little bit of all that. So a good chunk of it also sort of unpacks the clerk's vision and hopes for assemblies beyond just this one, but what we hope the assembly is getting about being the church, as well as making some of these discernment and decisions, how to be the church in the place where it's located, is a big part of what's being talked about. You may have learned about the hands and feet efforts. The St. Louis was the first assembly where we had that 223rd, where we did the march through St. Louis and delivered offerings that paid for cash bail. So the end cash bail march, and getting some people literally out of jail that day in order to be with their families while they awaited trials. So in Baltimore, there had been plans for some similar hands and feet, the church on the ground interactions in Baltimore. And so those are being worked on. Those took obviously a different form in last year, but next year we'll be back to doing something engaging with the people in Louisville. One of the things we learned through St. Louis, which on the public facing piece of the NCASH bail march was it was successful across the board. Getting to that march was a learning process for the Office of the General Assembly, for the clerk himself, who had this idea and wanted to do it, and then sort of he will say, I'm not telling stories on him, he will say this out loud, so I guess he sort of forgot his organizing background and forgot to check in with the local community and the folks who were doing that work on the ground. And so we had some conversations in the last couple months before the assembly where the local folks working on cash bail said, hey, we want to be a part of this. You can't just blow into town and do this thing and blow out. We have partnerships and momentum that we're working on. And so we worked really very closely at the end with the folks in St. Louis. And so that's certainly how it's going, and how it went in Baltimore and how it's going in Louisville. So we are working very closely with the folks who want to help shape what our public action will look like in Louisville. But each of the idea is that each of the smaller groups of committees will have a chance to do some sort of, and be a part of some sort of on the ground action and learning, so that we can take that home to our home communities and have learned the questions to ask about how to engage in a community. The goal is not just to come and serve Louisville, but to learn what I can bring home to Wabash Valley or Black Hawk or Geneva or all the different places where we live. So it's not a one and done, but a learning capsule to bring back to us. So the theme, and as that stuff develops, is all going to be on that website that I put in that box and in the news that you can sign up for. Sorry, was there a question?
I also wanted to say thank you so much and all the leaders, I think, who really stepped through the last GA, not knowing kind of what we were getting into. And I would imagine just bucket loads of conversations following about how can we be better, because we're right out loud. And it was just beautiful to watch, knowing the previous way of doing things, as well as how you adapted and how we're all adapting. And I think there's some beauty in that, in helping us be challenged out of the ways we were and into a new something, whether we like it or not.
Thank you.
Well said.
You got me thinking.
Lucia's one of our leaders. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I wonder too, I know we've got folks on the call, Stephanie, who have particular interest in the role of a young adult advisory delegate, and how that will be the same or different at 225. Can you speak for a minute or two on that before we
I can do my darndest. We had a meeting with a number of previous young adult advisory delegates just a couple of weeks ago to start shaping, and getting their input on what is that experience, how can we do that, because it will be different without the same number of people on the ground at the same time. So that's one of the places where 100, it was never it was never the full possible delegation. There were always some presbyteries that didn't send. So 125 to 140 young people, young adults on the ground at the same time. And this time about a quarter of that'll be in the same place at the same time. So it'll be a little bit different in that sense. But we talked about using the opportunity to gather the young adults virtually ahead of time. And so the young adults have traditionally had the best training on parliamentary procedure. The rest of the commissioners get jealous because we give the young adult advisory delegates, and not even the missionary or the others, it's really young adult advisory delegates, get this like really in-depth how to use the system training that nobody else tends to understand. And so oftentimes when you're on the floor of a presbytery, if you're really smart and you don't know how to get something done, you ask the YAD, because the YAD had really good training about that. And so they can figure that out. So they will still have in-person gatherings when they're on the ground and in place. They'll be in a quarter of the size as the previous ones. They will have ahead of time some online trainings just for them, and then some that will be related to the whole and community building, not just talking at you training, but community building times. And one of the things we've been talking about is how certainly young adults, like any other group, are not all of one mind on everything, but there are some ways to build some caucus groups and some communal voice as a group that's really important, that we don't want to lose in this assembly. And so making sure that they can gather and organize and caucus together ahead of time is going to be super important.
Great, thank you. So, last call on questions. Any or closing comments? What questions does this presentation raise for you? What's your reaction? What do you think? Okay.
I'll add one last thing that I'm excited about, if that's okay.
Yes, that was my next question. Closing thoughts.
One last thing so one of the things that last year's assembly, if you followed it or followed the news after it, there were some, it'll take longer to tell the stories, but there were some acts of demonstration. There were some use of parliamentary procedure that some folks felt closed down conversation and shut out voices. And some of that happens at any assembly, but it was highlighted in particular last time when there were some items of business and some commissioners and some staff folks and some corresponding members talking particularly about Black women and girls and some ministries and some opportunities that were being raised, that voices were felt like they were silenced throughout the assembly. And it really got us looking and thinking in ways that we had dabbled in ahead of time before previous assemblies, but hadn't had such a spotlight shown on this time around. Thinking about how is the assembly, the processes we use, parliamentary procedure, Robert's rules, standing up and talking and fighting your opinion and this and that. How is that more accessible to some cultures and less accessible to others? How does it privilege some voices who know how to use the system and quiet others who don't? How does it work when you're speaking in English as a first language rather than translating in your head and trying to figure out what was just said and there was a 30-second time limit and then the moment passed? So we've been doing a lot of thinking about and talking about equity and accessibility to even just the process of decision-making at the assembly that we probably never would have in this in-depth or this quickly. Because of what was raised at the last assembly and what the format really highlighted. So I'm really excited about those changes and those possibilities. And when I talked about parliamentary training, I said we give that to the YADs really well. Well, we don't. We often hope that folks come with it from their presbyteries, but that's really uneven. I have no doubt you have a fantastic training program in your presbytery, but there are some who have never heard from their EP or GP before they show up in town. They have no clue what to expect and how the system's going to run. And so we're paying a lot more attention to that and expecting a lot more opportunities for getting familiar with how an assembly goes about making its decisions, to try to open that process up to everybody who's at the table, whether that's through translation or just through understanding, or having places designated to ask the questions. So, how do I make the kind of motion I want to make? And who can do that, and at what time is that appropriate? Because there's been a number of times throughout history of the assemblies where somebody has tried to get something done only to find out that they should have done it 10 minutes earlier and they can't do it an hour later. It's just the way things move. And some folks know those rules and some folks don't. And not because they're not available, but because we haven't bothered to figure out who needs to hear them. And so I'm excited about those changes and that accessibility opening up.
Wow, that's a good note to end on. Stephanie, when you talked about your history with the church and your love affair with the work of mid-councils and higher governing bodies of the church, it occurs to me that you are in the perfect role. It's the right time in PCUSA history. I'm thinking you might be the Esther of this story, and serving COGA for such a time as this. It has to be somebody who loves the church and loves the church assembled to do this work in this time that requires so much dedication and energy. And those other things, that imagination, intelligence, and love. Thanks so much for your service to the church. Thank you for being willing to be with us today. And thank all of you, because sharing your time today is also a sacrifice. And I hope this was helpful to you in your own discernment, as well as the ambassador role you might play as you invite people to consider whether God is calling them to stand for nomination. I'd love for the Presbytery of Wabash Valley's nominating committee to have a bunch of great people from which to choose to form a slate for election by the assembly. That would be a beautiful thing, that there were a number of people who want to try out this new format and learn and grow with a church that is learning and growing every day.
Yeah, it's a great year for people who like experimentation.
There you go. We will not call anybody a guinea pig, but
right. Well, there's some people who just love that, who like to jump into a new thing.
That's
and,
right.
And try it out. This is the year. If you're worried about it being a boring old, everything's always the same year, this would be the year.
Great. Fantastic. Well, everybody, thank you so much. Thanks, Vicki, for always being the person who gets us started and records for us. Thanks again, Stephanie, for being with us.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
All of you. Go in peace, and may the God of grace go with you this day. Take good care, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.